In 2002, Russia began issuing passports to residents of two breakaway regions inside Georgia's internationally recognized borders. By 2008, more than 80% of the population there held one. That August, when war broke out, Russia's stated justification was simple. It was protecting its own citizens. South Ossetia and Abkhazia are two regions that fought their own wars to break away from Georgia in the early 1990s as the Soviet Union collapsed. Both have functioned as de facto independent territories ever since, patrolled since the 1990s by what were, until 2008, officially peacekeeping forces, mostly Russian. On August 8, 2008, full-scale fighting broke out between Georgian and Russian forces in and around South Ossetia. 5 days later, a ceasefire held. Georgia calls what happened next an occupation of its own territory. Russia calls it recognizing two nations that had already been governing themselves for over a decade. 1991 to 1993, South Ossetia and Abkhazia fight and win de facto independence from newly post-Soviet Georgia, with mass displacement of ethnic Georgians from both regions. 1992 and 1994, ceasefires install Russian-led peacekeeping forces. 2002, Russia begins mass issuing passports in both territories. 2003, Georgia's Rose Revolution brings a pro-Western government under Mikhail Saakashvili. August 1 to 7, 2008, sporadic shelling and failed ceasefire talks around Tskinvali, South Ossetia's capital. Night of August 7 to 8, Georgian forces launch a sustained artillery attack on Tskinvali. August 8, Russia responds with airstrikes across Georgia and ground forces in South Ossetia. August 10, Georgia declares a ceasefire and withdraws. August 12, a ceasefire is negotiated between Russia, Georgia, and France. August 26, 2008, Russia formally recognizes South Ossetia and Abkhazia as independent states, a recognition only a handful of other countries have ever joined. September 2009, an EU-commissioned fact-finding mission concludes Georgia's initial shelling wasn't justifiable under international law, but that Russia's response subsequently went far beyond the reasonable limits of defense. February 2022, Russia recognizes two more breakaway territories, this time in eastern Ukraine, 3 days before invading the rest of the country. Russia's own government described its August 2008 intervention as what it called a peace enforcement operation, forced by what Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov characterized as acts of genocide under Georgian orders that, in his words, could not be left unpunished. In this frame, Georgia was the aggressor that broke an existing ceasefire and attacked civilians and peacekeepers Russia had a legal mandate to protect. Russia's recognition of South Ossetian and Abkhaz independence 2 weeks later was framed not as annexation, but as respecting a self-determination claim. The West itself, Moscow argued, had already validated earlier that same year by recognizing Kosovo's independence from Serbia over Belgrade's objection. If Kosovo could separate from Serbia with Western backing, Russia's position was that South Ossetia and Abkhazia were entitled to the identical outcome. Georgia's foreign ministry describes August 8, 2008 as a full-scale, unprovoked attack that Russia had prepared for years in advance, not a response improvised in 5 days, pointing to a passportization campaign that had already handed the region's population Russian citizenship on paper before a single shot was fired specifically to manufacture the justification Russia would later use. Tbilisi's own account also emphasizes what came after the ceasefire, not just the 5 days of fighting. The ethnic cleansing of Georgian residents from both territories, Georgia's severing of diplomatic relations with Russia in September 2008, and an ongoing, officially stated policy goal of deoccupation and peaceful reunification through diplomatic and legal means, not military ones. The European Union's own fact-finding report, published a year after the war by a mission it commissioned specifically to settle the question, split the blame in a way that satisfies neither side's account completely. Georgia's shelling of Tskinvali, it concluded, was not justifiable, but Russia's response, though initially a legitimate defensive action, then exceeded reasonable limits and itself violated international law. A neutral verdict, and both governments got exactly half a vindication. The deeper asymmetry is the one this series already knows from a later chapter. the exact sequence Russia used here: passportize a population, invoke their protection, recognize a breakaway territory once the fighting stops, reappeared in 2014 in Crimea, and again in February 2022 in eastern Ukraine, this time with the recognition coming 3 days before the invasion instead of after it. Same toolkit, reordered. A single use of a justification can be circumstantial, a response shaped by one specific crisis on its own terms. Use the same justification, the same passports, the same peacekeeper framing, and the same recognition of a breakaway republic twice, 14 years apart, on two different neighbors, and it stops being circumstantial. At that point, the pattern itself is the evidence, regardless of how either individual case gets argued. Maybe that's what this episode adds. Sometimes the clearest proof of what a government's policy actually isn't found in what it says about any one crisis. It's found in which parts of its own playbook it's willing to run back. A 5-day war, a fact-finding report that split the blame down the middle, and a strategic playbook that reappeared in Ukraine 14 years later, almost move for move. Next time, we go to the precedent Russia itself invoked to justify all of it. A 2008 Declaration of Independence that the West recognized and Serbia never has, and that this series has already mentioned twice without telling the full story: Kosovo.